academics, teachers, social workers, engineers, managers, nurses, and Netflix writers are not working class. What if I told you that this is true? What then? What if I told you this was just true? And what if I proved it to you that it was true? Would you take back what you said? Would you feel bad? We're going to break down every facet of this tweet and its implications. And by the end of this, if you were coming at this against Jackson, you're going to feel like a fucking idiot. In the main, this tweet is true. Let's first address, before we hear Hassan's reaction, because we're going to save that. We're going to address a lot of commonplace...
Theo6 Jeans donated $5. Most Marxists aren't even aware that you can control a company without ownership. Most leftoids understand a deeply confused view of our economy. Owning a business doesn't transmit a class. They're wage earners that outperform business owners.
Thank you, Diogenes. I'm going to actually explain it to you so simply. I'm going to explain it to you so fucking simply that it pisses me off how right we are compared to the fucking reaction we got. The first response. Are you downplaying the suffering of teachers and nurses? Because they go through a lot of shit. The left has a Madonna complex, where class is defined by the extent of your suffering and grievances. That's the first thing we're going to begin with. Why have you made the assumption that class is based on suffering and grievances? Why have you made the assumption that class is based on suffering and grievances? What are you saying? That Twitch streamers are the working class? No! At no point did Jackson ever imply that. I have gone on record myself saying the exact opposite. Our personal background is no more definitive, necessarily, of our class position in the realm of politics as with Marx, Engels, Lenin's, or any other fucking Marxist in history who clearly did not come from proletarian backgrounds. So no, we are not fucking saying that Twitch streamers are working class. We've never said that, because being working class is not the same thing as being good or bad or suffering enough. They have translated Marxism into an encyclopedia of emotional grievances with which to justify an economy of virtue signaling, suffering, and morality. The more you suffer, the more good and virtuous you are. They made it seem like he was saying academic teachers are all bad. He said they're not working class. He didn't say they're bad. He didn't say they're bad people. He didn't say they're less virtuous. He didn't say they're not suffering. He said they are not working class. Ebob, it doesn't matter how hard you work. Doctors work hard too. It's not even about whether you work with your hands or not either. I'm going to explain to you definitively. So much so, if any Marxist can come on here and challenge what I say when I'm done with this, if you can so much as sustain the opposite view, amidst its inevitable logical and theoretical contradictions, I'll give you $500. On the spot, no questions asked. Not everyone criticizing this tweet is a Marxist. I know. I'm going to say something very clear. Jackson deleted this tweet. He deleted this tweet because it was bad optics. What I am disappointed in are so-called mature, aware Marxists and supporters of both me and Jackson who joined the chorus of people attacking him because of this tweet. You can think privately that this tweet is bad optics, but your job is to not join the fucking chorus of seething leftists who come and attack it. Now, this tweet was particularly bad optics.
Jimberly 2 times donated $20. Having a busted nylon Soviet flag hanging from the window of a multi-million-dollar Los Angeles mansion says about as much as is needed to be said about Hassan's beliefs.
I agree, Jimberly. Thank you so much for the 20. Appreciate you. Your job is not to fucking cave into the pressure of this flood of leftoids. Now, this was bad optics because it did reach some normie nurses and some teachers who also got upset with it. Because it was a bad storm. It was a bad storm, and it was bad optics. I think Jackson understands that. I understand that too. And I'll explain to you why it's bad optics. It's very simple. It's this very simple distinction that's going to literally solve all the confusion about this. Ready? Let's focus on teachers, nurses, and possibly social workers. Are these people class enemies? No. No. They're not class enemies. Just because someone is not working class doesn't explain what proximity they do have to the working class or what the relation to the working class is. That's not enough to explain it. All you're doing is pointing out something very simple. These people are not going to form the core of the working class movement in the United States. The reasons for which I'm going to literally explain to you so simply. Okay? They will not form the core of a working class movement. They may be a part of the working class movement. They may have a proximity to it. They may not be class enemies, but they will not form the core of any working class movement in the United States. Now let's be clear about something. In the colloquial sense, the non-Marxist sense, you do say that nurses, maybe social workers, and teachers are working class. In the colloquial sense, they obviously are. And the reason they are is because, like other working class Americans in the colloquial sense, they're doing their daily grind. They're busting their ass every single day to put food on the table, to support their families, and they're working day to day, hour to hour to do that. They are working class in the colloquial sense, yes. But this is why you have to be very careful about distinguishing the science or even just the political, strategic, scientific perspective of Marxism from the colloquial and cultural one. So from the colloquial and cultural sense, obviously teachers and nurses are working class. But if we are political strategists and we are having a class analysis of our society, we have to critique all of the social formations and elements and ask the question of what relationship will they have to a working class political strategy? What is their fundamental and essential class nature? Right? That doesn't mean they're going to be class enemies. It just means you're not going to be relying primarily on them to form a working class movement. And that's a very important distinction you have to draw. Okay? Now, this is another distinction we're going to have to draw. I'm specifically only going to be isolating teachers and nurses and possibly social workers here, right? Because let me tell you what, Netflix writers, possibly engineers, I would say engineers can be split 50-50, and academics almost entirely are class enemies. So academics, 50% of engineers, maybe, and managers and Netflix writers, those are class enemies. That's just, they are class enemies, 100%. As a class, they're going to be class enemies, right? Engineers maybe can be divided along class lines, but the rest, yes, they're class enemies. Besides teachers and nurses, for reasons I'm going to explain. When you understand class, some people are going to say, class is just based on what your relationship to the means of production is. That's true, but the means of production is very vague. The means of the production of what? Of economic value? Of commodities? Because if you're looking at it from that perspective and you're applying that to 2021, you are not going to be able to explain classes in terms of ownership. Right? The idea of, are you an employee or an employer? That's what defines class. That's a political distinction that's based on how you're going to be recognized by the law and tax distinctions and things like that and federal regulations. That's a legal distinction. That's not actually a fundamentally economic relation. I want you guys to understand what economics means. I know a lot of people say class is not income. It's not. But income is part of class. And the reason it's part of class is because economics is about how material goods or access to material goods is distributed across society. So if you're looking at such variations as, a employee that's getting salary $200K a year, or like Hassan said, a labor billionaire like LeBron James, compared to, a coal miner or compared to a janitor, that is not a meaningful, you don't have a meaningful concept of class. Class is supposed to talk about the different relationships to the economic means of production. If you're defining a relationship to the economic means of production so broadly that it encompasses radically different economic strata and economic ways of life and economic wealth, your notion and concept of class is fucking worthless. If your concept of class is just about employees versus employers, it is not specific enough to actually explain the very observable economic differences in our society, the economic outcomes in our society. Because class is about the relationship to the economic and not just political means of production. And what I mean by that is it's not just based on your title in relation to a business. It's actually based and supposed to be the determining factor as far as your relationship to the way in which we produce and consume things. So when you're talking about class, you have to begin with that understanding. It's supposed to explain the economic outcomes that we see in our society. If your notion of class has absolutely no fucking explanatory value as far as the economic outcomes that we see in our society, you don't have a concept of class. There are clear economic differences, very discrete economic differences between Netflix employees and people working in factories. They have radically different economic ways of life, patterns of consumption, and so on and so on. Just night and day, right? If you're saying they're part of the same class, your concept of class is fucking worthless because it is not able to explain the different economic outcomes between those different groups. Remember, the economic relation to the means of economic production is supposed to explain the economic outcomes you see in our society. In Marx's time, the proletariat was a specific class with a specific pattern of consumption. It had a specific cultural reality. It had a specific way of life. It had a specific geography, and it could actually be identified economically as distinct from the rest of society. If your notion of what the proletariat is so fucking all-encompassing that it's going to start encompassing professors and graduate students and it's completely fucking worthless. You may as well have no fucking concept of class whatsoever. You may as well just say, are you an employer or an employee? We're for the employees. Fuck the employers. You're not talking about economic class. You're talking about a very arbitrary, politically instantiated, and politically recognized distinction as far as workplace status is concerned. It's an extremely arbitrary political distinction, right? Because it rests upon the assumption that the 19th century form of private property has persisted up to this present day, when it hasn't. Ownership, so-called ownership of the means of production, is not like in the 19th century, where you had the power to arbitrarily exercise the freedom to do whatever the fuck you wanted with your property, and it's just your property, is what it is, do what you want with it, as Marx described of the commodity. That's not how ownership works today. Ownership is derivative today, and by derivative, I mean it takes more the form of like derivative stock contracts, like the right to buy things, the right to sell things, the right to have exclusive contracts with government projects, the right to have a monopoly over a certain IP. It's a derivative form of ownership and not a direct form of ownership. So the idea that you can directly transplant the 19th century classical liberal form of ownership to the 21st century and base your class analysis off of that is going to lead you to extremely stupid fucking outcomes that are not able to explain the variations among the various different social formations and segments of society along political, cultural, and economic lines. It has no explanatory value if that you're going to commit to such a dogmatic analysis. Now, here's an important distinction you have to draw when it comes to teachers, nurses, and many social workers. Even in a Marxist sense, I would argue, even in a Marxist sense, you could call them working class. But as nurses and as teachers, they are not working class. The basic meaning of that is that in terms of their labor, it is not an abstract or general form of labor. It's a form of labor bounded up with definite institutions. So when nurses are going to act on behalf of their interests as nurses and not just as human beings trying to make a living and trying to get by, they're not going to do so as members of the working class. They're going to be doing so as people who want to defend their current institutional and professional position. It doesn't matter how poor they are or how hard they work. In a fundamental material sense, they are not going to represent general labor. They are going to represent the specific and private interests of the institution that they work for. When push comes to shove, if they act as a class. What's incredibly ironic about Hassan is one of the ways nurses and teachers can assert themselves as working class rather than as teachers or as nurses is things like general strikes, where they risk destroying the institutions that they work for in order to assert their fundamental human dignity as deserving a basic standard of living and a basic level of living conditions and so on and so on. When they do things like general strikes, that you could say they're acting as a working class, right? And it's interesting Hassan is pointing this out because Hassan, and we're going to get into this actually, attacked the panel that was hosted by many influencers to call for a general strike and strategize about how they can get a general strike going in this country. A general strike is a way for people to withdraw from their specific institutional context and act as one working class people. Nationwide general strike. People on Twitter and Hassan himself, Hassan doesn't like the idea of a national general strike. And the reason why is because a national general strike is a great leveling process. It means that if you're a Netflix employee, you don't have as much of an incentive to engage in a nationwide general strike as a janitor, right? A janitor's like, yeah, or a McDonald's worker. A McDonald's worker's like, yo, fuck my job. You know what I mean? Like, my job fucking sucks. I don't want a general strike. But a Netflix employee is like, I don't really want to risk it because I'm kind of in a comfy position. So a nationwide general strike, a general strike is a way for a general working class to assert its existence, right? But Hassan doesn't like that. Hassan prefers for graduate students to organize within their cozy confines of because that way their interests will not be weighed against the interests of the country's actual general working class. You understand the game that they're playing? They went after Jimmy Dore and the rest of them's call for a general, nationwide general strike because they fear this tremendous leveling process, which is going to turn the professional managerials, if they commit to their LARPy working class pretensions, it's going to make them equals of the actual working class of this country. But the professional managerials do not have the same incentive to risk their current social position that the country's general working class does. And the truth is, even nurses and teachers don't have that incentive themselves. Teachers are an extremely institutionalized social formation. They're very much dependent and very much instantiated in their specific institution of government public education. Another important thing about pointing out how, as nurses and as teachers, these are not members of the working class. Again, as human beings, you can maybe say they're members of the working class. As citizens of this country, you can maybe say they're members of the working class. But as nurses and as teachers, they're not. And the reason you can say that The reason it's important to point that out is because the left has fetishized nurses and teachers as like the vanguard of the working class because their interests have for a long time been aligned with those of the Democrats, the social engineers, and the liberals, right? The social engineering Democrats who have this agenda of engaging in this cultural social engineering project are very easily able to win over teachers and nurses because those people are already overly socialized and institutionalized. When you have a Marxist perspective, you don't have a black and white perspective. You say, oh, nurses and teachers are bad. Oh, they're reactionaries. Oh, they're class enemies. Oh, they're enemies of the people. Oh, they don't work hard. Oh, they're parasites. That's not true. They are hardworking people who are trying to get by day in and day out to support their families, right? You have to have a scientific view of this and not an emotional one, okay? You just have to understand that as teachers and as nurses, they're not going to form the nucleus of a working class movement in this country. Well, yeah, Netflix employees are parasites. I will stand behind that 100,000%. But nurses and teachers, this is really what we're going to get into today, right? There's so much to cover, but the way you're going to be able to define and measure this very simple understanding of who is and isn't working class is Marx's concept of simple labor. This is the first chapter of Capital. You know, it's boring, right? I'm going to be very brief and then exit out. It's going to be very, very brief. The value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract, the expenditure of human labor in general. And just as in society, a general or a banker plays a great part, but mere man, on the other hand, a very shabby part, so here with mere human labor, it is the expenditure of simple labor power. And this is the important part we're going to highlight. The labor power which, on an average, apart from any special development, exists in the organism of every ordinary individual. Simple average labor, it is true, varies in character in different countries. This is very important, and at different times. But in a particular society, it is given. Skilled labor counts only as simple labor intensified. Okay, what did Marx just say here, right? Let me give you an example of what he's talking about as far as simple labor is concerned. So he already told us that it varies in character in different countries and different times. But it basically and more or less represents the type of labor that an average person, an ordinary person in a given society with an average number of skill is going to be performing. So how do you think about that? Well, what's the kind of labor that any old dumbass, fresh out of high school, for example, in the post-war period, is going to be engaging in? What are they going to do? They're going to go work at a factory for Ford or for GM, and they're going to be able to have a family. They're going to have this average middle-class baseline standard of living, right? It's going to be the factory job. Now, in the post-war period in the United States, you have to have this understanding of the history of the working class in this country. There was a social contract that was arrived at between the government and the American citizens, more or less, right? Or at least the baby boomers after World War II. You are mostly factory workers, and you're mostly doing these heavy industry, coal miner jobs, right? A lot of people on Twitter are being like, oh, you're fetishizing that class just because they're manly and masculine and because of their aesthetics. No, that's not why. There's a very specific scientific reason why we are privileging that class as the working class. And the reason is because in the post-war period, the United States as a state was built on the basis of an economic social contract, according to which an average normal human being in the United States is going to be guaranteed a basic job, a basic standard of living, and that the government is going to organize itself around, in a way, in a perverted and twisted and ironic sense, the U.S. kind of became a workers' republic. It's going to sound stupid. Oh, we got this Twitch streamer saying we're a workers' republic. But hear me out here, right? Our state and our government, at least officially, formed around fulfilling the interests of this general labor, of the general working class, right? Now, we all know the story of what happened. We all know the story of what happened. During the 1970s, these jobs started to ship overseas. So the shadow of this once clear form of general labor, of the general working class, began to haunt the country, right? People like Trump would come and promise the jobs are going to come back. And that is why Trump formed the nucleus of, you can say it's a reactionary, but it is an authentically working class movement. Trump's movement was. You could say it was a reactionary form of a working class movement, but it was a fundamentally working class movement because it represented the general demand by the population on the basis of the general form of labor that can be applied to everyone. Now, some may reproach me as, hey, Hazs, aren't those factory workers and coal miners and the rest of them also institutionalized in the sense that they're very much tied down to their companies and they're willing to serve the interests of their companies? I mean, Hazs, what better example of this is there than oil workers? Oil workers defend the interests of the fossil fuel companies because it's how they make a living, right? The institution of the fossil fuel companies. And my approach will be, yes, but the difference is that they only do so insofar as those jobs represent a general form of labor for the American citizen, for the country. It represents the general form of labor they have come to expect after World War II and around which the political relationship between the state and the people has been based. And it's the breaking of this social contract that actually resulted in Trump's movement and the Trump phenomena in general. Because this social contract was broken, that's why you had the Trump phenomena, right? We have to be clear. The working class is not only going to be defined by where it is working and the nature of its profession. That's a very important and big factor. But the working class is also going to be defined in the political sense. Like, if we're going to say what expression of a political demand is a working class demand, of this general expression of the general interests of general simple labor. Simple and general labor in the abstract. What forces represent its interests? Now, when nurses act as nurses, they are not representing the interests of general labor. They are representing the interests of people who are educated in a way that the majority or even a significant amount of the country is not going to be. And the same is true for teachers. When teachers act on the basis of their interests as a teacher, they are only doing so insofar as it represents the whatever barrier to entry it is to being a teacher. A teacher is not a job that is generally replicable for the general broad strata of the population. Whereas when the steel workers and the construction workers and these type of people are representing their interests in general, like cohering them in the way that it was in the Trump movement, they are at least making the pretense to a type of job that more or less anyone can have, right? That, or at least that's how they think of the job, right? Well, this is a job that an average Joe can have. It's the job of the average Joe of this country, right? Are tech workers in the boat? No, they are PMC. They're professional managerials. It's very simple. Your class interest is going to be expressed at the level of the interests of labor in general. Labor in general. Not labor in your small little fucking graduate student workplace, but labor in general. What is your relationship to labor in general? That's what's going to define it. Now, you could also say that, well, Hazs, the type of jobs that the heavy industry people have isn't something that the majority of the country can just have. It does represent a specific segment. That may be true, right? But it's a form of representing general labor. Now, I agree. Those types of jobs cannot represent the majority of jobs people have in this country. Why do you think so many people have to work in the service sector? Is it because they're lazy and they're not tough enough to work in steel? No, it's just those steel jobs are, because the jobs have shifted overseas, not really attainable for most people anymore. But they do represent the type of general labor that was whose standards of living was earned by the working class movement of this country after the post-war period. You have to keep this word in mind. General labor. General labor. General labor. Okay? That's how you understand the interests of the working class. Despite those jobs no longer being attainable, the heavy industry jobs that form the nucleus of Trump's movement represents the general interest of general labor and is therefore the most authentic working class in this country. Because, and I'll explain it to you here, let's say you work at a shitty job at McDonald's, grinding day in and day out. If you try to unionize your job at McDonald's, all you're basically saying is, this job at McDonald's is befitting for a dignified human being. No, it's fucking not. Service sector jobs are bullshit jobs that are meant to waste the time of so-called surplus populations, which is, of course, a Malthusian anti-human category that our elites believe in. But that's what they're meant to absorb, is people that are considered not needed for capitalism, supposedly not needed for capitalism. But when you act on the interests of general labor, you have to ask the question of, what types of jobs should ordinary Americans have? What types of jobs should we have? What types of jobs should we expect, right? What types of jobs represent our interests and the interests of our labor in general? And those jobs are going to be the heavy industry jobs, because those are jobs that are not only socially necessary in the sense of socially necessary abstracted from material nature, but they are literally the jobs materially necessary for our reproduction as human beings. You don't need service sector jobs. That's the truth. You only need service sector jobs because we are having our time wasted by the 8-hour day, so we don't have enough time to attend and serve ourselves, and we don't even have enough money to serve ourselves. But imagine, for instance, if the Communist Party adopted as its platform shortening the workday to 4 hours, or 2 hours even, and having a general vocational trade school program, abolishing the service sector so that we could all have heavy industry jobs that we work, 4 hours a day, supposedly, and we have free time, plus more wealth to do what we want with it, right? That would be a working class demand. Now, that's not something professional managerials are going to get behind, because professional managerials reproduce their existence on the basis of managing the way in which human beings currently have to live their lives. And even Netflix creative artists are producing shit to appeal to the ways of life we have right now that involves this suffocating lack of economic emancipation and freedom. How do you solve the problem of automation? You solve it by shortening the hours of you solve it by shortening the workday and the work week. That's how you solve automation. Shorten the workday and shorten the work week. Simple as that.